Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Welcome back to our class on Julius Evola. We're continuing our discussion of selected essays from Evola's collection known as The Bow and the Club. I have had occasion to make the observation more than once in this series of lectures on Evola that I consider Evola to be a particularly astute observer and even diagnostician of many of the features of modern life that are characteristic of the degenerative processes, the corrosive tendencies of what is known as the Kali Yuga. And the example that we will examine today of his diagnosis of these features of the Kali Yuga is that of language. Now, the observation that modern language or modern discourse in whatever language has markedly declined in modern times, has descended to a tremendously low level, is not something new. But again, among the traditionalist authors, there's always a groundedness, a rootedness in principles, in metaphysical doctrines. And so in this essay entitled The Decay of Words, Evola is really looking at the decline of language in the Kali Yuga. And he will illustrate this decline through the study of a selection of 15 words. And the 15th and final word, which he looks at, turns into a kind of extended analysis of the notion of the traditional notion of fate as opposed to the modern notion. So he has selected in this chapter, The Decay of Words, 15 words or terms from Latin. Virtus, honestus, gentilis or gentilitas, genialitas, pietas, innocentia or innocentia, Patientia, humilitas, Ingenium or Ingenium, labor, Otium, theoria, servitium, stipendium, and finally fatum. So this is a rather elaborate examination, a minute examination in some cases, and some a little bit less, some more cursory, of terms from Latin. And of course, he wrote in Italian, and there's obviously a close relationship between Italian and Latin. But almost all of these terms, given that we're reading this in English translation, are recognizable in English, although in some instances, the Latin terms in question and their English cognates are in a comparatively lesser state of decay compared to their state of decay in Italian. And this is noted by the translator in the first footnote of the chapter on page 40, where he says, as the reader will see, many, if not all of the examples Evola provides have made a similar pattern in English as they have in Italian. So far, so good. English, however, has been somewhat more fortunate in certain of the cases that follow. Now, he explains why this is the case. We owe this happy turn in part to the lexical richness of our multi-rooted language, and in part to the fact that words of Latin origin English are already imbued with a sense of formality and distance, which to some extent protects them from common pawing. That's certainly true. Latinate terms in English do have a somewhat more of a prestige value as opposed to words of more direct Anglo-Saxon etymology. Nevertheless, the translator observes that despite this, English too has declined steeply and dramatically in the recent centuries. A few reflections on English in particular will be offered in the footnotes that follow for the benefit of this translation's readers. So he's certainly right about the decay and decline of English discourse. So let's just jump right into Evola's analysis of the decay of words. Begins on page 39. This is the 5th chapter, or the 5th essay in the Bone the Club. Opening paragraph. One of the indications that the course of history has not at all amounted to a form of progress on any level apart from the purely material is the poverty of modern languages compared to many ancient ones. So again, he's seeing he looks at the decay of language and the decay of words as symptomatic of the Kali Yuga, and he has observed in other essays which we have looked at about the importance of the regression of the castes. We also saw his notion of the how did he phrase it? The civilizations of space and the civilizations of time, the emergence of the breed of the evasive man. So all of this is connected. In terms of structural organicity, writes Evola, articulation and flexibility, not one of the living Western languages can compare, for example, to ancient Latin or Sanskrit. Now, a person who has not studied Latin or Sanskrit may be taken aback and shocked, surprised by this observation. But it is true. Anyone who has studied Latin or Sanskrit immediately recognizes the truth of what Evola is claiming here. The only modern language, according to Evola, and here my experience also confirms this, that is an exception, is German. And of course, it's well known, especially for English speakers. People talk about, oh, German is really hard. If you have to take a foreign language, take French or Spanish. So German has this in common with Latin or Sanskrit. This, shall we say, highly inflected character. In Latin and in Sanskrit, there are so many different declensions of the noun. The conjugation of verbs, verbal endings, it's really quite complex and even convoluted for someone who comes from contemporary American English to study an ancient language of this kind. Evola includes Scandinavian languages along with English in this process of erosion and leveling, as he calls it. He says that, generally speaking, it may be argued that the ancient languages just mentioned, namely Latin and Sanskrit, were three-dimensional, whereas modern ones are two-dimensional. Here, too, time has exerted a corrosive influence. It has made languages practical and fluid to the detriment of their structural coherence. This is but a reflection of what has occurred in many other areas of culture and life. I think that he also could have mentioned, in the context of Western civilization, Greek, but the fact that he's writing in Italian and he's going to, as we will soon learn, is going to focus on Latin, it's not surprising. I think he just mentioned Sanskrit as an example of an Oriental language. So he's in no way trying to give an exhaustive listing of such ancient languages. But rather than focus on their structure, he is going to look at specific instances of words, hence the title, The Decay of Words. Words too have a history, he tells us, and often the change they undergo in terms of content provides an interesting measure of corresponding changes in their speaker's general sensibility and worldview. Now, as this chapter commences, we will see that since he is focusing on Latin, Evola is very interested in the ancient Roman understanding of things. And Evola saw ancient Rome as embodying, again, this key concept in Evola's understanding of the traditional past with a capital T, namely heroism, the heroic tendency, the heavenly or Uranic kind of impulse or religion, the supremacy of a heroic conception of life, of the heroic conception of action, of honor, of rigor, of rectitude, of justice. So everything opposed to the breed of the evasive man, as we spoke about yesterday. And he contrasts this with the kind of notions that we have among most modern people in the concluding pages of the essay. So once again, it's a reflection of its kind of heroic values and attitudes, especially in connection with the notion of fate. And fate, fatum, is intimately related to decisive action as opposed to mere acting. Anyhow, not to get ahead of things, but that just gives you perhaps a better idea of what he's trying to do in this rather relatively long, I would say, essay. So it is pretty dense. So let's look at these terms very carefully. So the first term that he singles out as an example of decay and corrupting and its corruption in modern modern usage is the term virtus or virtus. And from this term we get words like virtue in English. But the meaning of virtue in English is completely decayed from what this originally meant in Latin for the heroic ancient Romans. The most typical and best known case is perhaps the word virtus. Virtue in a modern sense has almost nothing to do with ancient virtus. All right, so virtue nowadays is associated with some sort of, bourgeois, moralistic, conformist attitudes. But for the ancient Romans, virtus or virtus meant strength of mind. It meant courage. It meant prowess. It meant virile steadfastness. It was connected to vir or vir, a term describing man in the strict sense, not in the generic and naturalistic one. And here I should point out that the term vir is also there in Sanskrit and continues to be used in various modern Indian languages, generally has the sense of hero, which I think is quite Interesting. There's a footnote here, footnote number 2 at the bottom of page 40, which glosses the phrase, the sentence I just read. That's to say, not in the generic and naturalistic sense. Footnote number 2, that is to say, the Latin word vir indicates man in the specific and gendered sense of masculinity rather than human being generally, which was represented by the Latin word homo. So vir refers specifically as a gendered usage, so it's referring to those who are men by sex, and carries these ideas of courage, virile steadfastness, and so forth. In modern languages, the same word has instead acquired an essentially moralistic meaning, one very frequently associated with sexual prejudices. So the modern term virtue, as I said, it has all these bourgeois, Puritan notions, what Evola calls a bourgeois, Puritan, and sexophobic morality. So today, in modern English, when we speak of a virtuous person, it's very different from what the ancient Romans would have meant by a vir, as someone who had virtus. And there is a Latin phrase which he mentions as an example, vir virtute preditus. So what does that mean? The footnote says, a man gifted with virtue. So what did that mean? That phrase referred to someone who had a kind of a steadfast, Evola says, proud, fearless, and heroic spirit. Very much the opposite of the modern bourgeois, moralistic, and conformist usages which we find in the Anglophone world. There's also a notion that the virtus has a kind of power, a kind of efficacious force, and the man of virtus has a degree of agency which a dissipated modern mere moralist does not. And it is in this sense that in English, I guess in Latin, in Italian as well, you can speak of the virtues of a plant or a herb or a drug. I don't know if that usage is very common anymore, but nevertheless, it is at least attested in lexicographic works such as the Oxford English Dictionary. The second term is honestos. And of course, in the modern form, that's just honest. You speak of someone who's honest. It's just a member of bourgeois society, somebody who's just, a nice guy, who's honest, who is someone who doesn't really do anything extremely bad. But in ancient Roman society, in ancient Roman antiquity, the term honestos referred to someone of an honorable, noble demeanor, someone who was of noble rank. So he mentions this Latin phrase, nato, or is this, no, this is Italian. This is not Latin because they dropped the H. So, gosh, how would you say this? I don't know Italian. Nato da onesti genitori, I suppose. An Italian phrase, according to the footnote by the translator, someone born of honest parents. And so today, obviously, when you say someone is born of honest parents, that doesn't really mean much. And in the view of Evola, this Italian phrase has almost a kind of nuance of irony, an ironic nuance, he says. Whereas in ancient Rome, he says it was used specifically to designate nobility of birth. And this nobility of birth was not merely a kind of sociological status, according to Evola, but that this phrase also, this term honestos also had a kind of sense of a biological nobility. So again, Evola does have a particular understanding of race, and his understanding of race has both a biological dimension, which he generally downplays or doesn't give as much importance as a kind of spiritual notion of race. Similarly, the Latin phrase that combines the first word we looked at, or a word derived from virtus or related to virtus, namely vir and honesta. So vir, honesta, facie meant a man of fine appearance. So I suppose there is some relationship between nobility, and then he mentions this biological dimension as well, but nobility and this heroic sort of demeanor also seems to have some kind of an corollary in terms of actual, I would say, maybe physical beauty or something to that effect. I'm terribly sorry. Please give me one moment. My apologies. So there is even a notion, I would say, of the sacred science of physiognomy. Now, of course, he does not explicitly mention this, but when he talks about this Latin phrase, vir honesta facie, man of fine appearance, and that inasmuch as vir indicates certain strength of mind, courage, a heroic demeanor, and honestas has this sense of nobility, I can't help but think that he may have some sort of a ancient notion of physiognomy in mind as well. And he makes what I think is a very important connection between the Latin term honestos and the Sanskrit term arya. Now, if you're interested in Buddhism, this is extremely important because in his, I think, seminal study and presentation of Buddhist teaching in the form of his full and very substantial book, The Doctrine of Awakening According to the Buddha, the concept of the Arya is very important. He saw Buddhism as a way for the noble, for a person of noble demeanor, the Arya, the so-called Aryan, quote unquote, a person of heroic temperament. He saw Buddhism as the ideal path for the Arya. So he construes the term Arya, and he's relating it to honestus as someone who is honorable and noble. And he doesn't have necessarily a biological understanding of the Aryan, as we find, for example, in excuse me, the modern conception of race in the doctrine, the racial doctrine of National Socialism, as we find, for example, in the famous National Socialist treatise known as not the Myth of the Blood, that's Evola's book. What was it called? The Myth of the 20th Century. It's a whole sort of study of race, and it's considered to be an extremely quote unquote racist and anti-Semitic work. So Evola does not share that kind of a racial interpretation or a racist, racist ideology that we find among certain groups that have also taken up the term Aryan. So I think it's very important to make that observation. The third term that Evola mentions in the Decay of Words is the term gentilis or gentilis, which also occurs in the form gentilitas or gentilitas. Now, it is from this root that we get the term in English gentle and also gentleman. Of course, in modern usage, such terms have in mind a person, a gentle person or a gentleman, a man of an affable and well-mannered demeanor. In ancient Rome, however, the term gentilis or gentilitas evoked the notion of the gens, namely I guess that's like the term genus or genus, and which I think is Greek. But whatever the case may be, the concept of gens, gens or gens in Latin, there's different ways of pronouncing Latin. There's different views on how Latin was pronounced. It has the sense of the stock, the race, the caste, he tells us, or lineage. So for the people of ancient Rome, someone was a gentilis if he possessed qualities deriving from a differentiated lineage and blood. So again, there's a kind of biological notion here of race, but of also transmitting this kind of quality. So what is this quality? Is it just a well-mannered person like it is today? No. This differentiated lineage and blood conveyed a certain kind of demeanor. A demeanor, Evola tells us, of detached courtesy, which is, in his view, something very, very different from the modern notion of quote-unquote good manners, which Evola says that even a complete nobody in a low caste, a parvenu is the term he used, can acquire by just reading a book on etiquette. And this is also very different from what he calls the modern notion of the vague, what he calls the vague modern notion of kindness. And he doesn't really elaborate on this further. He simply says that few people today are able to grasp the fuller and deeper meaning of expressions such as a gentle spirit and the like, which survive as isolated extensions of the original meaning in the language of the writers of the past. So he's kind of brief here. So he simply says that, someone who's gentilis, it refers to something sort of innate in their lineage, and it conveyed a demeanor of detached courtesy. I suppose something akin to a kind of affable nature, or I suppose that's how maybe I would explain it. But he doesn't go into any further detail. He just leaves it at that. The fourth example is a related word. It looks almost the same, and that is the word genialitas or genialitas. Now, apparently, this is related to the notion is from where we get the word genius. He says, "Who is a genius today? A predominantly individualistic man who is imaginative and full of original ideas. At the extreme, there is the artistic genius," he says, "that in humanistic and bourgeois civilization represents an object of fetishistic worship to the point that the genius, more so than the hero," you see, hero is always important, "the ascetic or aristocrat has often been regarded within this civilization as the highest type of man." All right, so that's the modern notion. So what it was the ancient Latin or ancient Roman conception. So the ancient conception, the ancient term in Latin, genialis, instead, according to Evola, alludes to something that is not at all individualistic and humanistic. So in complete contrast to the notion of genius today. It comes, he says, from the word genius or genius, which originally designated the formative and generative inner spiritual and mystical force of a given gens or blood lineage. So again, he's connecting this to noble birth. One could argue, he continues, therefore, that the qualities of genialitas in the ancient sense had a certain relationship with the qualities that are racial in the highest sense of the word. So I assume by the locution in the higher sense of the word, I'm sorry if I said highest, it's in the higher sense of the word. I assume that by that locution, he has in mind not the merely biological notion of race, but his more nuanced conception of race as a spiritual differentiation rather than merely biological one. By contrast, he continues, to the modern sense of the word, the element of genius distinguishes itself from the individualistic and the arbitrary. It is bound to a deep root. It obeys an inner necessity through faithfulness to the already supra-personal forces of blood and race, forces that, as is well known, were connected in any patrician lineage to a sacred tradition. So as you can see, it's not merely biological. There has to be some sort of a sacred affiliation, a sacred tradition to which any so-called, quote unquote, patrician lineage is necessarily connected. The next one, the fifth one is I find very interesting, given the decay that has also taken place in religion and religious concepts, and that is the term Pietas, from which of course we get words like piety and pious and so on. So Evola says that pretty much everyone understands what is meant by a pious person in modern terms. In other words, someone of a more or less, and I quote, humanitarian, sentimental attitude. He goes on, pious is almost synonymous with compassionate. All right, so again, he typically begins with the modern decayed understanding of the Latin origin of modern terms, and then he shifts and explains what it meant in the ancient Latin tongue and what it meant for the ancient Romans. So in Latin, pietas instead pertained to the realm of the sacred. It designated the special relationship that the Roman had, first of all, with the gods, and secondly, with other elements of the world of tradition. He capitalizes that word here, including the state itself, and state is also capitalized. So with reference to the gods, Evola explains that pietas meant an attitude of calm, dignified veneration. So you see, there isn't this idea of a kind of fear and cowering before the gods for the ancient Romans. Pietas was an attitude of calm and dignified veneration, a sense of belonging, and at the same time of respect, a sense of mindful concern, even of duty and loyalty, an intensified form and feeling elicited by the stern figure of the pater familias, hence pietas filias. So pater familias is not just the father of the family, the head of the family, but it's more like the head of the clan, as explained in the footnote, the oldest male member of a particular clan, and hence the notion of filial piety, or in Latin, pietas filias, loyalty. And of course, this transfers over into the realm of the state as well, as I think is clear. So in the political domain, we have the Latin phrase pietas in patriam, meaning loyalty and duty towards the state. And in that sense, it's related to the concept of justitia, or justice. So he who is foreign to pietas is unjust, almost impious, and does not know his place, the place he must hold within a higher order, which is both divine and human. So again, there is a hierarchy. Piety for the ancient Romans is part and parcel of this hierarchical gradation of society. where everything has its place and everyone knows their place. And I think it's very interesting that he connects that to the notion of justice in Latin, because also in Arabic, in the Islamic understanding of things, the word for justice in Arabic is adl. And it's translated as justice, which is fine if you have the original Latin sense in mind. But of course, in modern terms, justice is another term to which he doesn't incidentally devote an entry in this essay. But in Arabic, the word adl, which we can translate as justice, in Arabic, adl means for a kind of harmony, or in which everything is in its proper place. A kind of balance, I would say, a kind of equilibrium, which is an expression of everything being in its proper position and place. So I think that's very interesting, that the Latin notion of justice is also very similar to the Islamic one. Then we have the term innocentia, or innocentia, or innocentia. I suppose these are all possible ways of pronouncing Latin. Innocentia, innocentia. This word too evoked ideas of clarity and strength. Okay, so in the modern notion, of course, is innocence. But again, that will also be seen to be a decayed form. This Latin term, according to Evola, expressed purity of soul. Whereas today, if you say someone is innocent, especially in a legal context, a modern law context, it just means that they are, that they aren't guilty. But this Latin term expressed purity of soul, integrity, disinterestedness, and righteousness. It did not merely have the sense of not guilty, as he says. It was free of the shade of banality found in the phrase innocent soul today, which is almost synonymous with simpleton. And then he points out that in other Romance languages that have this term, like in French, it can, innocent can actually be used to refer to an idiot or a fool, someone feeble-minded. All right, so now we have Patientia or Patientia, from which we get the modern word patience in English. So again, he will point out that the modern sense of patience and a patient person has nothing to do with the ancient one. So typically today, if you say someone is patient, it means someone who doesn't lose their cool. They don't get angry in situations where especially they're forced to wait or put up with inconveniences or face obstacles, I suppose, is how I would explain it. So how has this decayed? Evola tells us, and I quote, "A patient person today is someone who does not get angry, who is not irritated, and shows, and this is also important, who shows tolerance." Okay, end of quote. But he goes on. In Latin, patientia designated one of the primary virtues of the Roman. It encompassed the idea of an inner strength and unshakable firmness. Okay, so patience for the ancient Romans also had a kind of sense of unshakable firmness, had a sense of maybe perseverance. It alluded to the capacity, he says, to stand one's ground, to maintain an unwavering spirit in the face of any setback or adversity. And according to Evola, this is why the race of Rome, again, the concept of race, was said to possess the power to accomplish great things as well as to endure equally great adversities. So apparently there's a saying of the ancient Roman historian Livy, et facere et pati fortia Romanum est, namely that it is Roman to act and to endure valiantly. So clearly the modern notion is pretty watered down in comparison. And here also you can see the primacy of the heroic virtues, the heroic conception of life. and the complete and total decline of that in the modern age. And here too, we can see this decay of words and of course the concepts and attitudes that those words express as a manifestation of the regression of the castes. So the ascetic and warrior caste have undergone or have been overwhelmed, by the lower castes. And so that is reflected in the language as well. Terms of what would have originally had a heroic sense are now invested with a plebeian and bourgeois kind of superficiality. This is especially clear in the modern understanding of humility. And that brings us to the 8th Latin term, humilitas. And remember that Evola is writing in Italian originally, in an overwhelmingly Catholic milieu, that is to say, a Christian society, or a society that is very much based in the Christian religion. So he says, with the religion that has come to dominate the West, humility has become a virtue. Now he makes the very important point that humility was never considered a virtue for ancient Rome. Humility, according to Evola today, is glorified by its very contrast to the kind of dignity, strength, and calm awareness described above. I think he's referring to the previous entry of Patientia. In ancient Rome, humilitas stood for the very opposite of all virtus. It meant baseness, wretchedness, lowliness, abjection, cowardice, and dishonor. And I think if you look at the early history of Christianity, it's interesting that they took this term and raised it up to a virtue. So that is a very radical shift, which obviously happens even before modern times. So this process of decay of the word humilitas, I think he is directly identifying with the rise of Christianity and its ultimate domination in the West as a religion. So this ancient Roman idea of humilitas, which understood it to refer to baseness and wretchedness and lowliness, abjection and cowardice and dishonor, was regarded with such opprobrium that death or exile was preferable to humility. And then he quotes this Latin saying, which I'm not going to read. I'm probably going to get it all wrong anyway, but it's there on page 45. So there were associations in Latin of ideas such as a low and evil mind, where in the Latin phrase in question, the word humilius is used, humility, to mean low. There was another expression in Latin, humilitas causam decentium or decentium, which referred to the inferior and guilty conditions of those being brought before a court. So here too, Evola brings in a notion of race or caste, both. He says that here too, the idea of race or caste comes into play. Humilis natus parentes meant born of the people. That is to say, in the pejorative sense, the people being the hoi polloi, to use a word of Greek origin, or the demos, another Greek origin term. Plebeian is the word he uses here, the pejorative plebeian sense, by contrast to noble birth. So humilitas refers to all of these sort of low, chthonic, lower tendencies, which are very much the antithesis of the heroic sensibility of the higher, heroic and ascetic sensibilities and virtues of the higher castes. So Evola tells us that a Roman of the good old days would never have dreamed of making a virtue of humilitas, let alone of boasting of it or of preaching it to others, which is what Christianity does. So even though he doesn't mention by name, he just says, with the religion that has come to dominate the West. In this entry for humilitas, he's making Christianity very much a target. So it's more than just the modern mentality of the Kali Yuga, but Christianity as well that is part of the decay of this word. And here it's interesting that he mentions a remark of Marcus Aurelius, although he doesn't, he just speaks of a Roman emperor, and I think it's the translator who mentions that it's Marcus Aurelius. So there's a statement ascribed to Marcus Aurelius that nothing is more despicable than the pride of those who say they are humble. At the same time, Evola takes pains to point out that does not mean that arrogance and presumptuousness are to be encouraged. Now, this actual statement, this is kind of problematic in the sense that Marcus Aurelius, he's referring to the Meditations, and Marcus Aurelius was a Roman emperor, but the Meditations were written in Greek. Many people think they were written in Latin, but that's not true. They were written in Greek. So what word did he use? So the translator glosses this, saying that the word humilitas does not appear in the original Greek of Marcus Aurelius. And the original quote is in book 12, section 27. This is the translation of the author in footnote 15 on page 45 of The Bow and the Club. He says, "For that arrogance which grows in arrogance for its own lack of arrogance is most irksome of all." So according to the gloss of the translator, what Marcus Aurelius had in mind is the Stoic virtue of modesty. Aurelius is a Stoic thinker, and this is the Greek term. How do you pronounce this? Eidemosune, I think. And this, the translator tells us, has little or nothing to do with Christian humility. So I think I'm on pretty strong ground when I say that this entry for humilitas, even though it just barely would take up an entire page in the book, is very much a kind of attack on Christianity and the Christian notion of humility by Evola. Number 9, Ingenium or Ingenium. The modern world, he says, has only preserved part of the ancient sense of the term, and once again, its least interesting aspect. So in Latin, ingenium signified, among other things, perspicacity, sharpness of mind, sagacity, and foresight. At the same time, it also referred to one's character, namely to that which is in each person organic, innate, and truly one's own. So the Latin locution vana ingenia was used to refer to persons without character. Redire ad ingenium in Latin could mean, according to Evola, to return to one's nature, to one's own nature. In other words, he says, to a lifestyle consistent with what one really is. And it is this sense, he says, that has been lost in the modern world. Indeed, Evola argues that this term has acquired almost the opposite meaning, in the sense that ingenuousness, if we understand that in an intellectual and dialectic sense, it clearly stands in contrast to the second meaning of the ancient term, which refers to one's character, to a style that conforms to one's nature. The modern term, according to Evola, indicates superficiality. by contrast to what is organic, a restless, brilliant, and inventive mobility of the mind, in contrast to a rigorous way of thinking perfectly suited to one's own character. Throughout these entries, we see time and time again the notion, the Evolian notion of heroism, the hero, and heroic virtues. Now, the next few entries, he goes into, the next two entries, he goes into quite a bit of detail. And this is the term labor in Latin. And of course, we have the English word labor. Now, if you think about the modern notion of labor and work, you naturally think of certain Protestant ideas. Namely, I have in mind, of course, the notion of the Protestant work ethic and the rise of capitalism, very famous work that used those phrases in the title by I think it was Max Weber. The notion of dignity of work and almost a kind of cult of work, a notion of work as being almost somehow sacred, but again, sacred in a secular sense. I mean, if people have any kind of a religion today, it is a religion of work. It is a religion of career in terms of duty and showing up for work. And again, this comes up again in another one of this comes up also in another modern ism, which has the character, functionally speaking, a functional equivalency to a kind of religion, namely Marxism and the left. They're obsessed with labor and the plight of the laborer and the worker. So there's a particular notion about work and labor, and work and labor are not looked down upon. And this is completely in contrast to the ancient Roman understanding of things. In Latin, this word had a mainly negative meaning. Although in some cases it could refer to activity in general, as in the expression labor rai militaris, activity in the army, its predominant meaning expressed the idea of toil, exhaustion, unpleasant effort, and sometimes even misfortune, torment, a burden, a punishment. Now, Evola says that the Greek term ponos had an analogous meaning to labor in Latin. And so the Latin verb laborare could mean also to suffer or to be anguished or tormented. So the Latin phrase quid ego laboravi means, why did I torment myself? Laborare ex renis ex capite means to suffer from backache or headache. Labor itineris means the fatigue and inconvenience of travel. So by these examples, Evola is trying to establish and illustrate the idea that the word had a mainly negative meaning in Latin. So from this, we see that for the man of ancient Rome, he would never have dreamed even of making labor into a sort of virtue and a social ideal. At the same time, anyone who knows anything about the history of ancient Rome could never characterize ancient Roman civilization as consisting of a bunch of lazy couch potatoes or slackers. So obviously, they had a very different notion of things. Work, quote unquote, according to Evola, stood in contrast to agere. Agere in Latin means action in the higher sense. Work, or labor, corresponded for the ancient Roman to the dark, material, servile, and insignificant forms of human activity, and referred to those for whom activity was determined exclusively by need, necessity, or an unfortunate fate. And here he remarks parenthetically that the ancient world also had a metaphysics of slavery. So opposed to these abject individuals who worked out of necessity, were engaged in labor due to some impediment, such as slavery, in contrast, there were people who were people of agere, of action in the higher sense, people who would act in the proper sense of the term, those who would be devoted to free, non-physical, conscious, deliberate, and to some extent, he says, disinterested forms of action. Indeed, the term work, which of course here is labor, would be in Latin, was not applied in the case of a person who exercised material activities, but rather it was applied with a certain qualitative character and on the basis of an authentic and free vocation. Such a person was an artifex. Oh no, maybe here I misunderstood. I think here he means the one who's engaged in true action, agere. That is the person who's an artifex. So in the decay of this term, labor, there's a very clear sign of the regression of the castes. And Evola points to this, although he doesn't mention regression, the phrase, he doesn't explicitly use the phrase regression of the caste, but on page 47, he refers to the eruption of the plebeian character, and he says, the change in the meaning and value of the word in question is therefore a very clear sign of the plebeian character that is increasingly come to dominate the Western world. A civilization increasingly shaped by what are in any complete social hierarchy, you see, castes, the lowest stratum. So the merchant and the slave castes, right? The modern cult of work is all the more aberrant because today, more than ever in our regime of industrialization, mechanization, and anonymous mass production, work has necessarily lost any higher value it might have had. Despite this, we have come to speak of a religion of work, of a humanism of work, and even of a labor state, making work a kind of insolent, ethical, and social imperative for everyone, to which one almost wants to answer defiantly with the Spanish saying, el hombre que trabaja pierde un tiempo precioso. The man who works loses precious time. I think that's really funny. So it's a very different understanding of things. So in the traditional world, work, he tells us in the concluding lines of this entry, that in the traditional world, even work could take the form of an actual genuine action, an agere. That is to say, there is a complete break in the modern notion of action and ancient notions of action. So that today work, labor, has a completely different kind of nature. It is characterized by what Evola terms a coerced, opaque, and interested activity performed not according to a vocation, so one's natural inclination, one's caste, but according to need, and above all for profit, for lucre. So one could see very much the 20th and even the 21st century, well, the modern times, as the age of economics, and man has become, human beings, you know, is a homo economicus. So that all human relations are ultimately reduced to economic ones. And it all comes down to how much money you have. And if you really don't have any money, you're in big trouble. So the notion of the money economy. You don't really have a kind of landed aristocracy, you know, in terms, in previous times, there were people who had landed aristocracy. They didn't work in the modern sense. There were lots of things which you didn't actually have to buy. People were independent. They would farm. They would be able to fix things themselves. They made things. None of this is done anymore. We have a mass industrial society. You have to have hard cash, now, of course, in digital form, to survive, to live. And so everyone has been reduced in some sense or another. Even the higher castes have been reduced to serfs and slaves. And the merchants, you know, the corporate titans, they're the ones who are really in control, and everybody ultimately works for them. So that's the situation we have today. Now, this term labor, entry 10, is very closely related to entry 11, otium or otium, which really means a kind of idleness. But of course, the notion of idleness is very much negative today. But I think more he has in mind the idea of leisure. And there's an interesting book by the Catholic clergyman and philosopher Joseph Piper called Leisure, the Basis of Culture. If memory serves me, he takes the starting point of his it's a small book, so I would call it even an essay, an extended essay. He takes as his point of departure in this treatise, Leisure, the Basis of Culture, this observation of Aristotle, that philosophy really only emerges when people have leisure, when they have when they're freed from the activity of mere labor, you know, in the Latin sense that he's using here, the ancient Latin sense. So otium, in the sense of idleness or free time, leisure, it's completely different today. So Evola says, according to modern usage, someone is idle, IDLE, when he is useless to himself and to others. To be idle is more or less the same as to be indolent, distracted, inactive, listless, and prone to the dolce far niente of today's mandolin playing Italy for tourists. This is referring to an Italian situation. So the Latin otium originally referred to a period of free time, essentially corresponding, according to Evola, to a state of meditative concentration, a state of calm and transparent contemplation. So he is contrasting otium very much with labor. To put it in a more contemporary idiom in English, contemplation versus mundane action. Not decisive action in the sense of agere, which we already met earlier, but contemplation versus mere act. Instead of saying action, let's say activity. So otium, this notion of a free time devoted to meditative concentration and transparent contemplation, was characterized by thinkers such as Cicero and Seneca. These are very important figures in ancient Stoicism. And it's important to note that the Stoic school and its writings in ancient Greek are rather few. And I think that were it not for figures such as Cicero, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, but especially Cicero, many of these ideas would not have survived, and they're very much somewhat more significantly better represented in Latin than in Greek. In any case, Cicero, Seneca, and other classical authors, according to Evola, chiefly understood otium as the healthy and normal counterpart to all forms of action, all forms of, let's say, activity, and even as a necessary condition for action, you know, for genuine, true action, agere. To truly be action and not agitation. Cicero observed that the ancient Greeks are rich not only in innate gifts and learning, but also in otium and diligence. There are a lot of quotations here in Latin. So a Latin writer named Scipio the Elder observed, and I'm just going to read the translation, he was never less idle than when he was idle, and never less alone than when he enjoyed solitude. Sorry, this was said of Scipio the Elder. Another Roman thinker, Sallust, wrote that my leisure will be more useful to the state than the busyness of others. The Stoic thinker Seneca had a treatise devoted to idleness, De Otio, in which he examined idleness as a form of pure contemplation. So Seneca introduces, presumably in this treatise De Otio, two kinds of notion of the state in this treatise, De Otio. A greater state without exterior and contingent limits that applies or includes both men and gods, and a particular earthly state, which one belongs to by birth. So there are those, according to Seneca, who serve both states at once, and those who only serve the greater, and those who only serve the earthly one. The greater state can also be served through idleness, if not better through idleness, by investigating what constitutes virtus, strength, and virile dignity. Clearly, this is the activity of philosophy, isn't it? Because the philosopher is interested in examining things, especially the ancient Greek philosophers were very much concerned, figures like Socrates and Plato, with the good. So otium, according to Evola, is closely linked to the tranquility of mind of the sage, to the inner calm that allows one to attain the summits of contemplation. So I think that in the modern world, obviously, contemplation is looked down upon, and activity, especially sorts of frenetic activity and activism, are valued over so-called ivory tower theorizing and speculation. But in the traditional understanding of things, Evola tells us contemplation is not an escape from the world or a distraction, but an immersion within oneself and elevation to the perception of the metaphysical order that every true man must never cease to keep in sight when living and struggling in the earthly state. So there is, even in Catholicism, the notion of sacrum otium, or sacred idleness. So this is very, very different to the modern notions. And Evola rails against this decay, this understanding in the modern world of otium. He says, this is why in relation to modern civilization, we should speak not of an active civilization, but of a restless and neurotic one. So the activity, this frenetic activity of the modern world, is not true action in the higher sense of the Latin verb agere, but is, as we just read, a civilization of restless neurosis. As compensation for work and a reaction against the strain of a life that has been reduced to a vain acting and producing, classical otium, contemplation, silence, the state of calm and pause, allowing one to return to oneself and find oneself again, is foreign to modern man. No, all he knows is distraction, the literal meaning of which is dispersion. He looks for sensations, for new tensions and new stimuli, almost as psychic narcotics. We find this in the modern search for constant diversion. People who are immersed in labor, in work, in labor, constantly look forward to the weekend so that they can dissipate themselves in a drink, in dance, in other diversions, in sport, for example, in pursuing their various streaming shows which they're watching, and so forth. All sorts of distractions and diversions. Evola speaks of this by saying, anything as long as he can escape himself, the modern man, in other words, as long as he can avoid finding himself alone with himself, isolated from the noise of the outside world and interaction with his neighbor. Hence, the radio, television, cinema, cruises, the frenzy of sports or political rallies in a regime of the masses, the need to hear things, to chase after the latest or most sensational news, supporters of all kinds, and so on. I think it's remarkable. This is added in the footnote by the translator that he said all of these things long before cell phones and the internet. He concludes this entry by saying that every expedient seems to have been diabolically brought into play in order to destroy any kind of genuine inner life, to prevent any internal defense of one's personality, so that almost like any artificially galvanized being, the individual will let himself be swept away by the collective current, which naturally, according to the famous meaning of history, moves forward according to an unlimited progress. I think this is absolutely beautiful. It's certainly true that the modern world, modern life is, I think, by design and diabolical design, been conceived and constructed in such a way as to leave no time whatsoever for contemplation, to leave no time whatsoever for the pursuit of spiritual ends, of ascesis. Naturally, you need time for this, and the entire structure of the modern world is diabolically and consciously constructed to make this impossible, if not exceedingly difficult. This brings us to number 12, theoria. So from that, of course, we get the notion of theory. Now, he doesn't go into this in too much detail. He simply says that to speak of theories today is to refer entirely to the abstract realm, abstractions far removed from reality. But in the ancient meaning of things, now mind you, theoria, it's used in Latin, but it comes from the Greek, theoria. In ancient Greek, it did not signify a purely abstract intellectuality, but a fulfilling vision, a particularly active act of the highest principle in man, the nous. The nous is the intelligence or the intellect, which Evola identifies with the Olympian and heroic human type. And there's a footnote here, and there's a kind of reference to another chapter in this book, which is chapter 7, where he deals with this in more detail, which this is taking us more time than I thought. I thought we would get to. We'll probably not get to that until next week, but that is on our reading list as well, namely the myth and fallacy of irrationalism. Anyway, we'll discuss that when we come to it. So we're almost done with the list, but we're not anywhere near done with this chapter. So the 13th item on the list is servitium or servitium. Clearly, we derive such terms in English as service and servitude and so forth from this. It comes from the Latin verb servio, servire, which has the sense of being faithful. But the predominant meaning is a negative one, namely to be a servant. And it is from this that you get the term servus or slave. Now, in modern times, just as there is a cult of work and labor, there's also a kind of cult of service, especially social service. In modern times, Evola says, the word to serve has become increasingly widespread while losing this negative and demeaning connotation to the point that, especially among the Anglo-Saxon peoples, service as social service has almost become a kind of ethic. And he considers this to be the only truly modern ethic. In the ancient Roman world, however, the tone of servitium is quite different. Evola says that this change in the soul of words is not a matter of chance. The fact that words like, and they're all related, these three, labor, servitium, and otium, have become common in their modern sense is a subtle yet eloquent sign of a shift of perspective, which has certainly not occurred in the direction of virile, aristocratic, and qualitative vocations. So he doesn't go into any further detail. He just says that servitium is another example of the regression, really, of the castes and the ascendancy, the abnormal ascendancy of plebeian values and therefore plebeian interpretations, resulting in the decay of terms such as labor, servitium, and otium. We now come to the 14th and the penultimate term on the list, which is the 14th, namely stipendium, from which we get the modern word stipend, which I think everybody understands today, some sort of a monetary remuneration for some action, for some service. But originally, stipendum, in the sense of stipendum merere, meant to be in the military or under the command of a particular leader. So stipendium had a military signification in ancient Rome. Emeritus stipendus meant having completed military service. Homo nullus stipendi meant anyone who had not known the profession of arms. So obviously there's a huge difference between the ancient Roman conception and the modern one. And so here, having just noted this, Evola wants to introduces a number of other words to which he doesn't give a separate entry. He says the complete meaning of other Latin words such as studium and studiosus currently only survives in certain special turns of phrase. And then he has some examples from Italian, which I really don't mean too much in English. So the notion of studio and study in ancient Latin, it had the idea of intensity of warmth and keenly felt interest, which of course has been obscured in the modern world. Study is seen as a very sort of dry, arid intellectual kind of pursuit. Then he returns back to he gives another example of studium. Studium belendi meant the pleasure and love of combat. And here he just sort of seems to be almost at random giving examples. I don't see how they are, maybe it's because I don't really know Latin very well, connected to stipendium, but he seems just to have thrown all these under this heading. He introduces also the term docilitas, which didn't have anything to do with the modern notion of docility, but meant good disposition or ability to learn. Similarly, the term humanitas did not mean humanity and did not convey any sort of democratic values, but originally simply meant a cultivation of the self, the fullness of life and of experience. The same applies to the Latin term certus or certus, from which we have the words like certainty. In the ancient Latin tongue, this notion of certainty, of something certain, was often connected to the idea of conscious decision. So this is how he goes on, and then he basically says, all right, enough is enough. And I would now like to bring all of this discussion of the decay of words to a close by examining the original content of three ancient Roman notions embodied in the terms fatum, felicitas, and fortuna. So fatum in English would be fate, felicitas is felicity, and fortuna would be fortune, right? And this is a kind of elaborate conclusion. All of the examples that came before, other than maybe the trio of, what was it, labor and otium and what was the other one? Labor, otium, and the one that came after. Yeah, sort of theoria, or was it not? So those are related to each other, but the rest were not entirely, completely related to one another. But he sees these three as being very close to one another and as expressing fundamental concepts of ancient Roman society. So in the modern world, we have a notion, of fate as being a kind of faceless, intransigent, blind power dominating over human life, and hence we have terms such as fatalism. And fatalism implies an inability, a kind of paralysis before impersonal forces. So Evola says, according to the fatalistic worldview, the individual is nothing. His actions, despite his apparent free will, are either predestined or vain, and events unfold according to a law or power that transcends him and that does not take him into any account whatsoever. The adjective fatal has a prevalently negative meaning: fatal outcome, fatal accident, the fatal hour of death, and so on. So that is an example of maybe how moderns understand the concept of fate, but modern people really don't believe in fate. They believe in the efficacy of human agency. Obviously, they wouldn't deny that there are some things which are beyond human capacity, beyond our control. But they read in this kind of a notion of fate into ancient civilizations. And I think that's what Evola is actually writing against here. He's saying that the modern notion of fate, that the ancients thought that fate was this impersonal force before which they were completely paralyzed, and that they lacked any agency, is simply not true, and that the moderns really do not understand the meaning of fate for ancient people. So in this vein, on page 55, he says, according to its ancient meaning, fatum instead, right, in contrast to these modern misunderstandings and misconceptions, essentially corresponded to the law of the continuous development of the world. This law was not deemed blind or irrational, or it was not deemed blind, irrational, and automatic, fatal, in other words, in the modern sense of the term, but full of meaning. So it wasn't blind or irrational, full of meaning, and proceeding from an intelligent will, not something random or capricious. Above all, the will of the Olympian power. So again, this notion of the Olympian spirit, asceticism, the heroic, differentiated person is coming through again in this writing of Evola. Here he makes a very important observation, he notes of an extremely important correspondence. And that is that the ancient Latin Roman idea expressed by the term fatum is related to or cognate with the ancient Sanskrit Indo-European term rita. And the rita indicates, as it says here in footnote number 30, the perfect or excellent order of the universe by which everything that exists is organized. Most suggestively, the word also means truth. It's related to the, etymologically related to words like ritual in English. And it is, I would say, analogous to the concept of a natural law. Roman fatum, he continues, referred to the notion of the world as a cosmos and order. Remember in an earlier, I think last week, we spoke about in his essays on the state, decline of the concept of the state and the reconstruction or revival of the concept of the state, the notion of how in all ancient traditional civilizations, there's always a myth of the order overcoming chaos, of cosmos being imposed on chaos, and how this implies or necessitates the imposition of limits. So Roman fatum referred to the notion of the world as a cosmos and order, and in particular to the concept of history as a development of causes and events, reflecting a higher meaning. So history is not without a deeper and profound meaning, because all things in the human realm proceed ultimately from principles. Even the fates of the Greek tradition, he says, while presenting some evil and infernal aspects due to the influence of pre-Hellenic and pre-Indo-European cults, often appear as personifications of the intelligent and just law that governs the universe in certain of its manifestations. Now, he thinks that this was a kind of observation in general, but he wants to single out the notion of fate in ancient Rome. He sees the notion of fate as having a particular importance in ancient Rome, and he thinks that the reason for this deep importance attached to fate in Roman civilization was, of all traditional and sacred civilizations, the one that focused especially on the plane of action and historical reality. So the ancient Romans genuinely acted in the sense of agere. It wasn't just a mindless, frenetic activity. Rome, he says, was less concerned with knowing the cosmic order as a supratemporal and metaphysical law than it was with knowing it as a force operating within reality as a divine will ordering events. This was, of course, intimately linked to the Roman notion of fatum. Fatum, according to Evola, comes from the verb fari, which also gives us the word fas, which means right, as divine law, rita in the Sanskrit Indo-European sense. So fatum, if understood this way, alludes, according to Evola, to the word, quote unquote, by which he has in mind the revealed word. Revealed in what sense? Revealed, according to Evola, first and foremost by the Olympian deities, who allow men to know what the right norm, the fas, deriving from the term fatum, and also announces what is going to occur. So there is a connection with the traditional ancient science of divination. So regarding, this second aspect, he says, in other words, announcing, the Olympian deities announcing what is going to occur through some sort of oracle or through some sort of divinatory, discovered through some sort of divinatory art. Regarding the second aspect, he says, in other words, the Olympian deities announcing what is going to occur. Regarding the second aspect, oracles, through which a special traditional art sought to discern in embryonic form whatever corresponded to situations in the process of being realized, were also called fata. These were almost the revealed words of the gods. This is a really interesting explanation and elaboration of the profound meanings conveyed by this ancient term and notion of fate or fatum. So if we want to talk about fate, we must understand that man's relationship, he tells us, to the general order of the world in ancient Rome and in other traditional civilizations in general was very different from what has come to predominate now. Although the idea of a universal law and a divine will did not erase the notion of human freedom, ancient man was constantly concerned about shaping his life and actions in such a way that they might continue the cosmic order and that they might represent, so to speak, an extension or further development of that order. So ancient man, traditional man, whether ancient Roman or ancient Egyptian or ancient Greek or what have you, was always concerned with genuine agere, genuine action, which would be in conformity with the gods, with heaven, with Uranus, and therefore was a manifestation always of the primordial act of creation, an imposition of order, of cosmos on chaos. And it's only then that you have genuine action. If you don't act in according with, shall we say, the will of heaven or the flow of the of fate, which you can determine through some sort of divinatory art, you are acting in a haphazard fashion, in a chaotic fashion, and this is going to cause problems for you. I think this is very interesting. And this, in fact, is truly a manifestation also. He's tying this into the previous discussion. This is actual pietas or piety. Why? Because it is an acknowledgement, a reverence, a veneration for the gods, for the divine forces, which are at work truly in the universe. And it's because of all of this that in the Roman world, even in public affairs, even on the field of battle, oracles and omens played such an important part. It says here on page 56, he says here on page 56, the Roman was firmly convinced that the worst mishaps, including military defeats, depended not so much on human blunders, weaknesses, or errors, as they did on neglect of the omens, meaning essentially the fact of having acted in a disorderly, shall we say maybe chaotic, and arbitrary fashion, following merely human criteria, severing one's connections with the higher world. In other words, in Roman terms, he tells us this would be acting without religio. Now, if you can translate that as without religion, you'd be wrong, because religio is related to religare in Latin, meaning connection, without connection. In other words, without connection to heaven. Without regard for, he says, and I quote, the expedient directions and right moment, ensuring a felicitous action. So remember, he said he wants to deal with the term fatum, felicitas, and fortuna. Note that fortuna, he continues at the bottom of page 56, note that fortuna and felicitas are often in ancient Rome only the other side of fatum, its specifically positive side. The men, the leaders, or the people who use their freedom to act in accordance with the divine forces hidden in things are successful. They succeed, they triumph. And antiquity, this is what being fortunate and felicity meant. He then refers to the modern historian Franz Altheim, who saw in all of this the effective cause of Rome's greatness. There is a footnote on the previous page, page 56, that says that the term religion, of course, derives from religare, and that's what you usually find to bind. But Cicero suggested another derivation from the Latin religere, meaning to read again, to undertake again. emphasizing the importance of rite and ritual, because in reading again and reciting again, you are reciting these, I imagine, sacred formulae over and over again, and thus and thereby establishing a connection, a regard for what he called already expedient direction and right moment, ensuring a felicitous action. So here on page 57, Evola tries to make an analogy for the modern reader in trying to clarify the link between fate and human action. He makes an analogy with modern technology. So he says that in modern science and technology, there are certain laws which govern things and phenomenon, and you can either act in accordance with these known laws, or you can ignore them, neglect them, because you have a free will. You can even act in a manner contrary to these laws, and thus meet with failure in whatever you're trying to achieve. You also could completely disregard these laws and still succeed in whatever you're trying to do, but only after an enormous waste of energy and encountering every kind of difficulty. So that's just an analogy. Having made that analogy, he writes, things are no different when spiritual and divine forces, rather than the laws of matter, are in question. Ancient man believed that it was essential to know, or at least to sense these forces, in order to get an idea of the conditions propitious for a given action, and possibly an idea of what he should or should not do. For him, challenging fate, rising up against destiny, was not something Promethean in the romantic sense glorified by the moderns. It was simply foolish. For ancient man, impiety, meaning the opposite of pietas, i.e., lack of religio, or of connection with and respectful understanding of the cosmic order, was more or less equivalent to stupidity, childishness, and fatuousness. There is a point, however, beyond which you cannot go. So Evola tells us on page 58, one might say the objective divine order connected to fate extends up to a certain limit, beyond which it ceases to be decisive and only amounts to a tendency. Hence the well-known astrological formula, astra inclinant non determinant, i.e. the stars influence but do not determine. So it's important, I think, I think what he's trying to say is that it's important to keep in mind that even though people did have recourse to these divinatory arts, things were not exactly written in stone, in the sense that it would indicate a tendency rather than a completely determined outcome. In other words, the possibility of human volition and free will was still there. So the point is that the ancient notion of fatum was not a notion of fatalism or determinism as understood by the moderns, but was a far more nuanced and complex relationship, as he has already elaborated in what has gone before. He further clarifies this by saying that, whether a certain action occurs or not, essentially depends on freedom. One must will it. If it does occur, that which was only potentiality is realized through human action. The human world will then manifest itself as a continuation of the divine order, and history itself will take the form of a revelation and a sacred history. Excuse me. It is evident, therefore, Evola says, that we're dealing with something quite different from fatalism as understood by the moderns. Just as any action that goes against fate is foolish and irrational, any action in harmony with fate is not only effective, but also transfiguring. Whoever fails to take fatum into account is almost invariably destined to be passively carried along by events. He who knows fatum, makes it his own, and grafts himself onto it, is instead led to accomplish a higher purpose by possessing more than a merely individual significance. This is the meaning of the ancient maxim that fata nolentem trahunt volentem ducunt. In other words, fate drags the unwilling, leads the willing. So he says that there are many examples from the history of ancient Rome to illustrate these more abstract and theoretical considerations, which he has explained without going into giving specific examples. He talks about something about the cult of Jupiter as just one concrete instance. So in conclusion, he says that Fatum is obviously very different from what the moderns understand. And if you go against fate, if you oppose Fatum, you can certainly assert your free will, but that assertion is a sterile freedom. It cannot have any kind of deep effect on the fabric of reality. By contrast, he says, when I act in such a way that my will constitutes a higher order, that is when it becomes the instrument by which that order is realized in history in such a state of coincidence or attunement, what I will may possibly become a command directed at objective forces that otherwise would not easily be dominated or would have no regard for what human beings desire or hope for. So this is very different from the way modern people think, and I think it is a beautiful conclusion to an otherwise very detailed and merely peculiar lexicographic and philological exercise. And he simply sums this up by saying that by giving these examples of the ancient and modern notions of fate or fatum, that these examples should suffice to give the reader of an idea of just how important what he would call an enlightened philology could be, in as much as it would shed light on the modern deviation in the Kali Yuga, not just in connection with these terms. I would even go further in terms of the overall decline of language beyond philology and even extending into the areas of grammar, syntax, and ancient rhetoric. So I will conclude this very extensive discussion, and now we can maybe open this up for comment and discussion. I am a little bit more limited by time today. The next essay is on the psychology of skiing. I don't know if we need to necessarily discuss that in too much detail. It's kind of a restatement of what he said in another essay in Meditations on the Peaks, entitled Ascending and Descending, which we did deal with. He simply contrasts skiing with mountain climbing, in as much as mountain climbing again expresses this sort of heroic struggle against natural forces to attain to the summit, to this third dimension. And the notion of ascending and ascesis is predominant in mountain climbing, which he does acknowledge was not practiced in the ancient traditional world, but nevertheless, which he thinks in the modern world has tremendous potential for the exercise of a certain kind of ascesis, as opposed to merely profane sports. And as an instance of this, he sees skiing as quite a good example of the downward tendency. In other words, they only ascend usually by mechanical means to the slope, only to come down. And he sees that as symbolic, although he's not completely opposed to skiing. He sees, it's a very practical way of, for example, getting around in these kind of alpine environments. But I think that's really the gist of what he has to say in the psychoanalysis of skiing. Skiing as a sport, as emblematic as are other sports, of again the falling away from the sacred character of games, for example, in the ancient Olympic Games. So another manifestation of the Kali Yuga. So I will stop there, and we can discuss as much as you like.
Yeah, there's obviously a lot of things to cover, and because Evola went so thoroughly and list has quite a long list. But I thought it was kind of just a novel way to do it, because kind of etymology allows him to cover a huge range of subjects, like surrounded around the same theme. But then it goes from like labor on one hand to religion to all the so many different things. So I thought that was quite a neat way of organizing it. But I guess the
Yeah,
first thing, like a big picture about the essay I want to ask, because I think you have a lot
please.
of experience,
Sure,
is
yeah.
yeah, is like when he talks about the kind of uh the complexity or the kind of beauty of certain languages. I'm not too proficient with languages, but because of Buddhism and my research of it, I do have, I do kind of slightly see what he's talking, or get a kind of a starting to understand what he's talking about with Sanskrit, for example. And I
Yeah,
can kind of guess that what people who aren't acquainted with studying languages, the way to explain it could be like the amount of meaning that can be conveyed in a single word or something, where maybe a single word can be a metaphor because of the nature of conjoining nouns
yes.
or verbs, like you said. So that's what I notice in German, for example, which retains that character. So it has famously long words sometimes in philosophical texts, and Sanskrit certainly has that too in religious texts.
It
It has,
does.
you can make a really long word to express something. So I think you might know like a dimension more than that because you know a lot of languages.
I think this is I think one of my favorite writings of Evola. And I think that his observations, although restricted to Latin, he does make remarks of a more general character in the opening paragraph. And those remarks of a more general character are completely true. I have always been interested in languages, and I took note of this phenomenon when I was studying various languages, especially Arabic, which is the foreign language in the sense of not being my mother tongue, to which I have devoted the most time and effort. And when I was studying Arabic, even in the earliest stages of my devotion to this language, I would examine words very closely. Certain words in particular. I mean, particular examples I don't think would necessarily be too instructive, but suffice it to say that I would subject them to an analysis similar to that of Evola by still being a novice, mind you. I would refer to the recognized lexica, dictionaries, lexicographical works in the language, and try and examine what the original etymologies, or as original as we could get to them, would mean. And that shed a completely different light on the meaning of terms, and you could see how in modern Arabic things have completely changed. So I think that's very, very true with Arabic. It's also true with, for example, in the Urdu language, the decline in usage, the decline in the way people express themselves. There's, even though Arabic, retains a kind of classical character to it, at least in its written form, a modern Arabic text, even though it's written in classical Arabic, doesn't sound like a text which was written 600-700 years ago. And people make mistakes in reading them because they again, notions and ideas and worldviews have shifted. Concision was also very important, especially in religious and metaphysical texts. This is especially true in the Sanskrit tradition, where they would try and say things with as few words as possible. So, for example, in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, the second verse is Yogash Chitta Vritti Nirodha. which means yoga is the cessation of all modifications of mind. Now, you could leave yoga untranslated, but people confuse what that means. Yoga literally means a kind of yoking or unification. So unification, or the realization of that Atma is Brahma, to give it a Vedantic interpretation, is only achievable through the cessation of all modifications of mind. But all of that is encapsulated in that tiny phrase. And that's why these works would have commentaries, and they were written in this way so that they could be memorized. And the same is there in Arabic. In Arabic, in the Islamic scholastic tradition, works would be written, compiled, sometimes in poetic form, to facilitate memorization, so that they would be a kind of mnemonic device. So there's a very important metaphysical poem which summarizes the teachings of the Islamic philosophical school of transcendent wisdom, which is very similar, I would say, equivalent to the Vedantic system, or and I might be going out on a limb, people may disagree with me, but this is my view, also analogous and very close to the transcendent wisdom school, which you find in Buddhism, particularly in the Tibetan tradition, the Prajnaparamita text. But anyway, that it's a very concise text. It says, معرف الوجود شرح الاسم وليس بالحد ولا بالرسم مفهومه من أعرف الأشياء وكنهه في غاية الخفاء. And that's just very concise, but it summarizes the whole thing. And if you're a student and you memorize that, and then you read the commentaries, because you have that as a mnemonic, then you understand what the whole arguments are. It says that all defining terms of existence, of sheer being, of pure being, are merely explications of the name, and they can neither be a definition in the Aristotelian sense nor a description. Being or existence is the most well-known of things, but its true reality lies in the extremity of hiddenness. That's what those verses mean, which I just recited in Arabic. And all of that sums up all sorts of discussions which you find in the commentaries. You don't find things like this today. People write, modern philosophical treatises are almost unreadable. Kant is unreadable. Heidegger is unreadable. Wittgenstein is unreadable. People may disagree with me, but I just think they're not being honest, because as philosophers, especially if they're professional philosophers, they've been socialized into a certain thing. In the final analysis, what is Heidegger really saying? It just sounds like a bunch of gobbledygook. So maybe I'm being a little bit too harsh here, but indeed you find this quality in language, and it's not just these highly inflected languages. I think some of the traditionalist authors may give this, people like Genon, who was very enamored of Sanskrit, and of course Arabic and other highly inflected language, that somehow ancient languages must be highly inflected and have, all these declensions like you have in Latin or Sanskrit, and then have all these very complicated verb systems. The odd thing is, and you must have studied these things, as perhaps you're a native speaker, you don't find that in classical Chinese. Modern Chinese maybe is another, Mandarin is a different thing, but in classical Chinese, you don't find that. It's very sort of concise, telegraphic sort of stuff. It's a few characters, and they argue all about that's the character of the Analects of Confucius. That's definitely the character in the Dao De Ching. Very simple. It just says Dao Kadao Fei Ching Dao Ming Kaming Fei Ching Ming. I'm probably getting the tones all wrong, but Dao Kadao, the Dao that can be Daoed, the Dao, the way, that can be talked about, is not the eternal, so to speak, Dao, and the name, the Ming that can be minged or named, is not the eternal name. And that's just one way to translate it. And there's something like 80, 90 different translations of the Dao De Ching. And none of them really are a waste of time to read if it's not your language. And there's so many commentaries. I mean, these are books that have a tremendous wealth of meaning. And you contrast that with modern speech and modern discourse, which is so utterly anemic and weak and banal in contrast. So I think definitely the traditionalist authors, people like Evola, have really hit the mark when they recognize the tremendous gulf between ancient languages and ancient discourse and modern languages and modern discourse. And that decay is indicative, once again, of this upsurge and this inversion this regression of the castes, where these lower, inferior human types and undifferentiated human beings and their patterns of thinking have engulfed the modern world and therefore infected modern discourse. And what you say affects what you think, and what you think affects what you say. And that is why we are in this particular situation. And modern forms of communication, which I'm not against communication, but I have in mind things like Twitter. They foster superficiality. And that's really the situation we find ourselves in. So I'm sorry I gave you a very extensive gloss there. I didn't mean to speak that much, but
no problem at all. That's very
those are my that's my take, so to speak.
yeah, no problem at all. That's very insightful. And like that kind of how Evola is right, kind of, or how the traditionalists' view on this is that the need for religions to have a liturgical language kind of implies this, where it's really not satisfactory to just use the common tongue to talk about such important metaphysical issues in whatever tradition they are from. Like in Islam, Arabic, it's kind of unique because it is still common, but like you said, even when it's commonly spoken, it's not the correct. I mean, it's not exactly as it was.
There's a vernacular dialect.
Yeah, vernacular, right.
Yeah.
So I was thinking also that when you talked about all the commentaries on such short text, it's kind of like it's I was thinking sometimes people think like, oh, these religious writers or religious authors, even if it could even be like a religious commentator on the primary scripture or something like that. But in any case, sometimes people think, oh, they must have been so naturally wise to come up with such a pithy thing that expresses a lot. But it could also, but now this is bringing to mind something that I hadn't thought of before, which is that maybe their familiarity with that kind of language trained them instinctually to be able to express such things. So it's not necessarily just like, it's not really the same like an author thinking of a creative metaphor or something. It's like language that's already in them, that is naturally that deep or something like that.
Yes, that's true, because in ancient forms of education, let's say in the Islamic tradition, which is influenced by ancient Greece as well, but you really began with formal study with the trivium, the three fundamental liberal arts. So you have logic, grammar, and rhetoric. And of course, in the Islamic world, the grammar in question would be the grammar of the Arabic language. And it wasn't just learning these rules, but in terms of the rhetoric, the literature, there were certain classic works which would be studied, and often important parts would be memorized. In the context of Islamic civilization, that would be the Quran, but also classical Arabic literature, pre-Islamic literature, and certain poets that come afterwards. And these were considered the models of imitation. And so there is always a certain amount of imitation. If the person comes with their own ideas and so forth, and that's a kind of chaos, to use these images from Evola. And on that, in order of limits, a cosmos has to be established. And you really have to imitate patterns for a long time before you can strike out on your own. It's not that creativity was denounced or decried, but creativity was understood as something that has to come afterward. You can't just make up something from nothing. You have to become part of a tradition and work in terms of that tradition. And so you would learn certain models, and that's how you learn to write proper classical Arabic. And the real gold standard for Arabic prose is rhymed prose. So in all classical Arabic texts, they always open with a benediction to God and to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is always written in rhymed prose. Up until the 19th century and early parts of the 20th century in the Arab world, people still knew how to do that. Very few people know how to do that today. I only came to study Arabic after I was already a mature adult, but I worked very hard. I can do it. In fact, I've done it in my own critical edition of some Arabic works. With my Arabic introduction, I have a whole introduction in rhymed prose, and it works. But these kind of models, this is not taught anymore. In the Western world, when young people, say in the Anglophone world, but in Europe as well, in the continent as well, they would go to school and they would learn Latin, and they would have models to imitate, and they would actually learn to compose Latin prose and verse. Who does that now? So there's been a tremendous decline. And I am sure that the pattern would have been the same in classical, in Chinese civilization. I'm sure that people would have learned certain classical Chinese, patterns. The Book of Songs is ancient sort of literature. The same is true in Japan. The same is true, I am sure, in the scholastic Tibetan tradition of Tibetan Buddhism and scholarship. I'm sure there are similar traditions. It's in fact striking how structurally similar they are across traditions. But in the modern world, all of this has been rejected. And that's why we have people today in English who can't spell, who can't express themselves, who cannot even write a proper letter. It's all email, but email and texting. But even in the form of email, if you're writing someone formally, I received an email some weeks ago from an individual who, for whatever reason, had come across some of my videos and so forth, and they wanted to interview me on their own channel. It was so badly written. It was very clear that this person does not understand, even though and I'm not going to obviously mention who this person is, but if you watch their channel, they're obviously native speakers of English, but they cannot write a proper formal letter to someone. And I had a kind of exchange of a few messages, so it wasn't just a fluke. The first time, this is how it was in all 2 or 3 messages that we exchanged. I think, what is going on? This is the situation you have today.
Yeah, that's a pretty illuminating example. And just I have just one more main question about the text, but then just to mention a thing, you're actually, I know for a fact in fact that you're right about at least about the traditional civilizations, I'm sure as well. But there's a book by a Western man who went to become a Tibetan monk, who basically confirms everything you said, because he wrote his kind of it's autobiographical, but it's
George
mostly
Dreyfus.
Yes, we read the same book.
The sound of two hands clapping.
Yes, so I was just gonna say he compares Tibetan monasticism with other religions in that book. So I was thinking, oh yeah, you must. It's definitely true.
Yeah, I don't own that book, but we had it in the library in one of the institutions I worked at in the past. In fact, I had them order it, and I read part of it. And oddly enough, later on, I actually met the man briefly at at one of the teachings of the Dalai Lama, which I I happened to attend in New Delhi. He was walking around there. I think he eventually went on to teach somewhere in the United States.
Yeah, he's teaching somewhere. Yeah. I was just recommended that book recently, and I read. It's some parts are a bit dense, but definitely the parts where he's talking about monastic education, it's definitely true.
Yeah, and remember he talks about memorization and how he had
yeah. So he talks about memorization. He talks about the grammar, the set curriculum, all these the structure of argumentation, which is very like. No one learns that outside of a university philosophy course, basically, which is a bit, which is unfortunate, of course.
But that's changed also in so-called, at least in the modern world, secular disciplines like mathematics. I mean, it shouldn't be. In ancient times, it wasn't a secular discipline, but even in mathematics, my bachelor's degree is in mathematics, and I studied a while ago, mind you, and it's amazing how bad things have become, because people they've become used to calculators. They've become used to all sorts of apps. They don't know how to, they're used to computers. I mean, when I learned mathematics, we had to graph these functions and so forth. We had to draw them. And because we did that, I can see in my mind, what the graph of, such and such a parabola or whatever actually looks like. And we also memorized lots of things. I mean, I don't have to to put into my calculator, what the sine of 30 degrees is, or even what the hyperbolic sine or cosine. I used to have all of these formulas memorized. And now nobody knows anything. This was not that long ago. At Purdue University, where I went, there were professors. Even then, you were not allowed to use a calculator on your mathematics exam. Of course, you were allowed in engineering and physics and chemistry because of the numbers and so forth involved. But in most mathematics classes, you were not allowed to use a calculator, because especially some of these programmable calculators, you could do things like integrals and matrices. You weren't allowed to do that. So even if you had to multiply two matrices together, like a 3x3 matrix, you have to be able to do it on a sheet of paper. This is all changed now.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, by my time, it was even worse, because we did have the so-called scientific calculator, but in the generation just before me, people used these things. They used slide rules. And I just got interested because, I never learned to use these, but I was fascinated. It's why, I found a few. They're still floating around there, and I kind of taught myself how to use them. But if you grew up using this, you have a much better idea of things like, logarithms and so forth. Most people don't have a feel for these things anymore. They just know that, you can just type it in to a calculator. You can forget about calculators. People have apps on their phones now for doing things. And there's even, I learned from my kids, you can take a photo of your algebra problem, for example. And there's some sort of app which, if your handwriting is good enough, will understand what that problem is and will tell you the solution. So this is a horrible, horrible turn of events, really.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much all that can be said about it.
Yeah. But anyway,
I guess the other like big issue that Evola was talking about and he spends the most time on is the like you were saying before about faith, and it's natural that he ends its essay on like one of the most important topics. And I was interested in this one in like kind of a comparative religion kind of point of view, because one of the first of all, I tend to be charitable towards Christianity, because I think in some other works Evola is as well, in like, for example,
yes.
Mystery of the Grail or something like that.
Right.
I think that's the most famous one. But in any case, one of the things most Christians would say about paganism, particularly Roman, because that's obviously such, and it's the most familiar type of paganism for them, because obviously is that back in those days the idea of the gods was more like fickle, more to deal with like Evola says, with a kind of understanding of fate that makes man a bit more cowardly or subject to the gods. Like, if for example, if a Christian who is not familiar this is kind of a straw man, but let's just say, imagine if a Christian without the proper understanding of classical studies were to encounter like the Iliad, for example, and see how the gods behave, they would say, oh, this is not a good type of religion or something like that. But Evola's clarification is kind of coming at it from, in other words, I don't think Christians would expect that response, because it does impart a lot of agency to man, which Christian might consider kind of unique to the free will idea, like you were mentioning. So on one hand, that's a division between Christianity and paganism. On another hand, it's a similarity, because I was thinking, well, could this idea, the proper idea of fate, maybe survive in like the idea of God's will or something like that, or God's plan? And as a Muslim, I think maybe you can offer insight into that. Obviously not to the, well, you have insight into the Christian and the Muslim side, definitely, but I was thinking that if you think that kind of survives in monotheism in that form.
What, in terms of a divinatory approach to things?
Well, I guess to the idea of fate as not as, because I guess to phrase it a bit better, Evola is saying fate is not fate does not leave man helpless. Was the original understanding. Then the monotheistic religions later says that it does leave you helpless, kind of. So convert to this religion where free will and is of a lot of importance. But free will cannot get rid of the idea of God's plan, which is in all the Abrahamic religions. So I was thinking, do you think faith survives that way? So it's in a sense like all Abrahamic religions have that element of tradition still inside of them, is what I'm thinking.
Well, to some extent, I mean, in the Islamic context, it depends on what kind of Muslims you're talking about. The Sunni Muslims have a theological position known as the Ash'ari school. Most of them follow the Ash'ari school. There's also the Maturidi school, but they're more or less the same on this. And they believe in a certain degree of predestination. But they get around it by saying that we don't know what is predestined, but they nevertheless do have a view of predestination. And honestly, it's not very philosophically solid in my view. I am not a Sunni Muslim. The Shias do not espouse such a view, and there were plenty of Sunni Muslims who were philosophers who did not adhere to the Ash'ari theological opinion, and they did not uphold such views. So there are certain things which are determined, which nobody can change. Although now a lot of modern people think you can change. You can't change the fact that you were born as a man or a woman. You can't change that you were born in such and such a location, in such and such a town, to such and such parents in a particular clan or family, and in a particular social status or caste, or the circumstances, shall we say, of your birth. You cannot change. At the same time, people have certain talents and inclinations and potentialities that other people do not. You can't change that either. People would also say, although they might even argue this now, you can't change other aspects of your genetic makeup, so to speak. Some people simply have a genetic predisposition toward maybe a particular kind of ailment if they do certain other things. If they don't take care of themselves, maybe some people are more susceptible to certain ailments than others. For example, there's various things you can't change, but there are other things in which you can exercise your free will. So for the Shias don't take that position. Shia theologians, they never held that kind of a position, and there are plenty of non-Shia philosophers in Islam who also didn't have that idea. At the same time, there is also the notion that God has knowledge of all things and all outcomes and what's actually going to happen in the future. The thing is, he did give human beings free will, and because he gave human beings free will, he might be able to predict, on the basis, because he has full knowledge of what everyone is going to do at any one time. But we don't. Our action is actually, I really don't know what I'm going to do tomorrow or next week. I may have some plan, but that could change. So the future, in some senses, is open-ended in terms of its nitty-gritty details, but in the whole aggregate, things are going to go a certain way. The universe is going to end. The Kali Yuga is this has to happen. It might be delayed, other things might happen, but it's going to happen, right? At the same time, it is also possible, everything that Evola said about divining fate applies in the Islamic context, although most modern Muslims or Muslims who are affected by the modern mentality often decry, denounce these things. There's plenty of divinatory practices in the Muslim world. There is a friend of mine who is also an academic who teaches at a prominent institution somewhere in the United States, who for every important action performs a kind of divinatory exercise before undertaking it. It's called istikhara in Arabic, and there's different ways of doing it. Some forms involve a bibliomancy of the Quran. Others have various other more elaborate methods. Astrology is also a part of, especially Shia Muslims. There are other sorts of divinatory sciences that people resort to. I myself also, for anything of any real importance, have recourse to such means and methods. At the same time, there's also a certain attitude among certain Muslims who are involved in a kind of advanced level of commitment to ascesis in the disciplines of Sufism and Irfan, of Sufism and Gnosis, in which they don't engage in these things on purpose, and they completely sort of dedicate themselves to their practice, and whatever happens, they accept. That's another sort of attitude where they're of the view that it's a kind of whole process of self-knotting, Noughting, where the servant as such has nothing before God, and the only thing that they're supposed to do is to actualize their complete and total servitude and devotion to Allah. So that's another attitude that you have there. So there is a there are varieties of ascesis as well, to use a Evolian turn of phrase from the doctrine of awakening in the Islamic tradition as well. But these divinatory sciences are there. And also in the context of Muslim sovereigns in the past, sultans and so forth, they would also often consult through some sort of divinatory means on the time to embark on a battle, the most opportune and propitious time to ascend the throne for a coronation, or to plan a wedding, or to break ground, so to speak, on a new building or something of that nature. Excuse me just 1 second. Yeah, sorry about that. So these occult sciences are still very much alive and well in the Islamic world.
Yeah, I think that's a great kind of way to understand it, where these kind of two things can coexist, because it's not really like it I guess there is an honest, like, religiously consistent understanding that makes such practices not equivalent to, like, kind of profane magic or something like that, or occult practices. There is
That's
a
right. That's right.
yes, in many, pretty much all, I think, world religions, they have something similar. Well, they have divinatory practices, yes, but more importantly, they know a way to make it consistent. So this is all to say that what Evola observe here is, it may, unfortunately, may not survive in how most people understand faith, but in
Right.
how religions are practiced, there is some kind of understanding of this still there, even if they don't use that word.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we were talking about, Dreyfus just a while ago about Tibet, right? George
Yeah,
Dreyfus and
yeah,
his experience there. But I mean, if you read about Tibetan Buddhism, the Dalai Lama did not
yeah, of course.
flee from Tibet, although he was evacuated by what I think it was the CIA and Indian intelligence
Yeah,
over 1959, until he got a proper, they consulted the oracle, the Nechung oracle, I think.
yes,
And
yes,
every major decision they consult this oracle.
yeah,
And for modern people, on the one hand, a lot of them just love the Dalai Lama, but I don't know what it's kind of inconsistent. But anyhow,
yeah.
so that survives very much in Tibetan tradition. There's a whole tradition of Tibetan astrology and
Hmm.
all sorts of things. So for tradition, for the world of tradition, these are sacred sciences,
Hmm.
and it's just a red herring that the village atheists always try to introduce about, fatalism in religion. It just doesn't exist. It's just like the idea that the
Yeah.
ancient man believed the world was flat. It's just another ridiculous red herring introduced by
Hmm.
moderns to discredit tradition with a capital T.
Hmm. Hmm.
I think it's a completely simplistic view to say that these ancient peoples had a notion of fatalism. It's a modern invention.
Yeah, I definitely think that's true. It's kind of, it's an assumption based on how, it's like assuming they're more afraid than they are, basically.
Mm, yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's a great kind of summary of how it's gone wrong, how it's been misunderstood. Yeah.
No, it's a great summary, and that is indicative of the amount of error and malicious simplification that's there in the modern world, because they can only resort to such um, simplistic, sort of these caricatures. Otherwise, they would be forced to actually confront tradition and
Mm.
actually engage with it, and then they would have to examine their own modern superstitions. But again,
Hmm.
this is something that the moderns really do not possess the fortitude or rectitude to do. They don't want to face these facts. If they did, they wouldn't be who they are.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, brilliant. I must say I have to conclude now.
Yeah, no problem.
I've
It's
got
quite
to
late as well.
make a move, but I really enjoyed the to and fro was great today. The
Yeah.
exchange was excellent.
Yep.